work it out.
Okay, I think maybe I have to do it, so I'm going to record.
It says it's recording, Jan.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk, but I should start by way of an apology to make it clear that I'm not a philosopher at all. And so I fear I may be appearing under false pretenses. That said, what I'd like to try to do in the next slightly less than half an hour is to return to my 2017 paper, and more specifically to respond to the critique of it which Jan provided in her 2018
preoccupied with we want
professorial lecture. There are some differences between Jan's position and my own, and I think it's worth trying to tease those out. So that's sort of what I'm going to be attempting to do. But I should also say that there's substantial common ground between us, and it might be a good idea to start with that. From Vygotsky, by way of Robert Brandom, Derry takes the proposition that one cannot have one concept without having many, and uses it very effectively to suggest what's wrong with the commonly accepted, or at least very widespread tendency in teaching to break the object of study down into simpler elements. This approach has been particularly prominent, or perhaps I should say virulent, in England since the imposition of the National Literacy Strategy 20 years ago. The strategy may have been discarded, but its legacy traces are still to be seen in English classrooms across the country. For example, in the explicit teaching of genres such as persuasion, through the itemization of persuasive techniques, the use of statistics, of repetition, of direct address, and so on, all gathered together under hideous acronyms like DAFORIST, and I didn't make that up, it really exists and is widely used in English teaching. And the consequence of this is that pupils are, in effect, encouraged to produce what my friend Myra Bars has called bad writing, writing that is organized around a checklist of atomized techniques, writing that lacks proper coherence or purpose or any sense of an audience beyond that of an equally mechanistic assessor. I won't go on about this, except to say that I think a great deal of public discourse around the effects of the pandemic on education has been based on precisely this accumulative and representational understanding of what learning looks like. So the discourse is all about catching up or not falling further behind. And I think that's a really bad way of representing what the pandemic has done to education, precisely because it treats learning as if it is parsable up into little bits that are force-fed to students. So I agree wholeheartedly with Jan that there is a problem with this conception of learning. And what Derry does is to propose a quite different approach. And I am going to be quoting from Jan's professorial lecture within this, and then kind of attempting to respond to things that she said. So this is Jan. Following Vygotsky, rather than introducing the learner to an accumulation of simple elements, we're encouraged to start by introducing learners to a rich domain in which they can begin to make sense of what follows from what, in which their responsiveness to the relevant reasons and relations that constitute concepts can develop. Now, my 2017 paper can be construed as an account of two lessons, Harriet's Romeo and Juliet lesson and Michael's final observed lesson. I'd want to suggest that both of these might be taken as instantiations of this Vygotskian approach. In both, the pupils are presented with a rich domain in which their responsiveness to reasons can develop. In both, pupils are working with complex material, they're intellectually engaged, and what they're doing seems pretty impressive to me. Michael's pupils have taken the genre of travel writing and reworked it for their own purposes. They perform a version of West African culture that is simultaneously appreciative and ironic, celebratory and sharply observed. And it's a performance that speaks back to their teacher, a carefully crafted response to his partisan promotion of Jamaica. What they're doing can also be construed as talking back to the genre of travel writing itself, its tendency to adopt the lofty perspective of the Western outsider, exoticizing and othering the culture that is being represented. In Harriet's lesson, I was observing a group of students paying close attention to a canonical text. they were exploring together, under the guidance of their teacher, the work that words do, the ways in which meanings are made. They were appreciative readers, able to make persuasive inferences, and they were enjoying themselves too, enjoying their ability to make powerful sense of it all. At the same time, they were being deeply ethical readers. Their interest in the words that are used wasn't separable from their interest in what is happening in the relationship between Juliet and her father, Lord Capulet, and they were sharply critical of what Capulet was doing. Their reading is thus a moral and emotional engagement with the text, not merely a dissection of it. Close reading here depends crucially on the student's already existing knowledge of the context of the utterances, the dramatic situation, and it enhances, deepens, and enriches such knowledge. There is, however, I think, a significant difference between what happens in these lessons, how I described them, and what I take Derry to mean in her phrase, introducing learners to a rich domain in which they can begin to make sense of what follows from what, and so on. The process envisaged by Derry is one in which the rich domain is the discipline or subject or some part thereof, the domain of what Vygotsky called scientific concepts. But in these lessons that I'm describing, I'm not at all sure that English is instantiated in any straightforward way as a domain of scientific concepts. In Thinking and Speech, Vygotsky acknowledges that the relation between scientific and everyday concepts is not a constant one, in two really quite important ways. First, that the processes of interaction between them is itself complicated. And second, that different scientific concepts, the concepts encountered in the disciplines, as it were, stand in different relations to everyday concepts. And Vygotsky provides examples to illustrate this second point. He suggests, not unreasonably, that learners are unlikely to encounter Archimedes' principle in their everyday lives. On the other hand, he says, the concept of brother is saturated in children's rich experience before ever they cross the threshold of the school. If anything, and I've made this point elsewhere, I think Vygotsky understates the situation of the concept of brother, because children don't just encounter that in their own first-hand experience. Many of them are unfortunate enough to have brothers, and so know a thing or two about brothers as living entities. But they also encounter the concept of brother in stories, in lots of different kinds of story. So their knowledge is already textual as well as extra-textual, as it were, lived or experiential, if you like, although that distinction is also quite a problematic one, I think. And that means necessarily that when they encounter the concept of brother or family or son or daughter or father, concepts that are pretty central to Harriet's students' exploration of Romeo and Juliet, they're encountering them on very different terms from a hypothetical encounter with the concept of Archimedes' principle, let's say. And so I think most of the concepts that the students in Michael's lesson and in Harriet's lesson are at play are much more like the concept of brother than the concept of Archimedes' principle. Students are drawing on their own experience to make sense of what they encounter. More than this, their experience, both lived experience and their experience as readers of a wide variety of different texts and kind of texts, is the material that's being worked on in the lessons. In both, concepts to do with families, family relations, and identities are centrally implicated. And in some ways, this is utterly unremarkable in that rather a lot of literature is about what goes on in families. Derry acknowledges something of this, and again, this is me quoting Jan. The terms in which Yandell talks of the social at the level of cultures and histories of the participants is, she says, insufficiently fine-grained. Emphasis on the biographies of pupils and what they bring to the classroom as source of the generation of knowledge is a common theme in constructivism. But to what extent can this account of the social deal with the nature of our responsiveness to reasons, or with one thing being able to stand for another? I'm not at all sure how useful the label of constructivism is, by the way, largely because it seems to cover so many different and disparate ideas and practices. But leaving that aside, What Derry seems to be attempting to do here is to create a simple binary between everyday and scientific concepts in a way that doesn't reflect what I understand to have been happening in these lessons. So, for example, the bottom set of Year 9 students in Harriet's class bring to their investigation of Romeo and Juliet concepts of historical distance, of shifting gender roles and identities across time, of funerary practices, of the conditions of production of the Renaissance theatre, as well as the knowledge of the conventions of the Western movie genre. Is all of this to be bracketed as everyday knowledge or as scientific knowledge? Where does it fit into that binary? And one of the points I make in the paper is that I'm not at all sure that the students' knowledge of the kinds that I've just gestured at is so very different from my knowledge of the Arthur Brooke narrative poem that was Shakespeare's main source. In suggesting that students' experiences, textual and extra-textual, are being worked on in the lessons, I'm not dealing, I don't think, with something as generalized, as lacking in granularity as students' biographies. In each lesson, students work on concepts that are part of their everyday experience, and simultaneously on questions of representation, how particular practices and interactions, how signs like mother, father, daughter have been and might be represented. Their analytic gaze is directed at how one thing can stand for another, and they're participating in activities in which one thing is made to stand for another. And on that, I want to say something about the interest that I suppose I've been pursuing over years with a number of colleagues, particularly Monica Brady, who's here tonight, I think, interested in what happens when school students use work in role as a way of exploring literary text. This can be an extraordinarily powerful way of engaging with the text, interrogating it as an act of representation, while simultaneously offering students a means of exploring their own identities and contexts. This is, I think, a particular and particularly generative instance of what might be taken to happen more generally when students or other readers, in fact, engage with imaginative literature. This doubleness of the engagement with the world represented and also with their own worlds, because of the space that the text provides for thinking about those worlds, is why I'm slightly skeptical of the binary distinction made by Rudine Sim-Bishop, who is a professor of children's literature. She's categorized texts as either windows through which readers explore other worlds, or mirrors in which they can recognize themselves. She's got very good reasons for that binary categorization, in that she's making the point that too few texts available to children and young people provide representations of minoritized experience. But the trouble with that as a binary is that I think texts often function both as mirrors and windows simultaneously. And so the category doesn't kind of quite work for me. I think one of the issues at play in the divide, if that's what it is, between Derry and me is to do with the category of experience, what learners bring with them into the classroom. And I think what's insufficiently emphasized in those who seek to marginalize the role of experience is that experience is never just experience. It's always already semiotically mediated. And that activity of semiotic mediation, inside or outside the classroom, involves intellectual work. But there is something different about the way in which experience is worked on in the classroom, I think, in that representations of experience become objects of scrutiny and provide opportunities for thought. And again, I think that's what's happening in the two lessons on which I focus in the paper. What I want to do now, how am I doing for time? I'm doing all right. I want to move on to what I take to be absolutely central to Jan Derry's position in her critique of my paper, which is the idea of normativity. And the way in which Jan deploys this concept of normativity is both in relation to the way that she conceptualizes disciplinarity, and to the way, more fundamentally perhaps, she conceptualizes language itself. First on disciplinarity, so here's Jan again. The phrase abstract knowledge, which I use in my paper, has received bad press, but impoverished characterizations fail to recognize that disciplines are dynamic and develop continuously. However, this doesn't mean that they lack the norms or rules that are necessary for engaging with them in the first place. Attention to a field or domain of knowledge entails focusing on normativity. That is to say, it entails focusing on the normative constraints that delimit the matter being taught and govern how concepts function within the discipline. For what it's worth, I think the phrase impoverished characterizations applies more accurately to the object of criticism in the first part of my paper, which is the way in which the UCL linguistics department would appear to represent the whole question of knowledge about language. From the way in which knowledge is represented there, you wouldn't be able to discern any sense of the dynamism or development of the discipline. This, following Popkowitz, is a peculiar kind of alchemy being worked on disciplinary knowledge, contested as well as dynamic, to make it the stodgy fare of the school's subject, bland and indigestible both. It involves the effacement or ignoring of the ways in which the discipline of linguistics has been transformed and contested by the social turn, by ethnographic emphases, by challenges to Saussurean models, to which I'll return in a bit. But there's a further problem here for me, which is that I think that Derry, like Michael Young, sees the dynamism of the discipline as internal, an activity, if you like, for appropriately qualified adults operating within the academy. This might, I suppose, by and large, be an accurate characterization of the disciplinarity that's applied to chemistry, say, but it doesn't work for English. In the 2017 paper, one of the things I'm suggesting is that students in Harriet's class are not doing some sort of preparatory work that might one day fit them for literary study, nor are they engaged in some sort of pale imitation of it. They're doing the thing itself. They're engaging in literary study. And a slight diversion here. Last week, because we're not currently allowed actually to visit our student teachers out in school, we've been involved in what are called virtual visits, which are not like visits at all, in that it means that we don't get a chance to peer inside classrooms and see what's going on. But I was having a virtual visit last week with a lovely student of mine who's been working at a school in Tower Hamlets. And he was describing what he'd been doing with his Year 8 students, reading a Neil Gaiman novel. And he said, he's a clever young man who read English at UCL, and he said, it's the death of the author. So he's referencing Roland Barthes' famous essay on the death of the author. He said, my Year 8 students understood that completely. They opened up a discussion in which they're talking about what is the role of the author, how much right do we have as readers to construe this text in our own terms. His subject knowledge mattered in that it gave him a perspective on the work that his students were doing, but it absolutely wasn't, as he rightly recognized, work that was fitting them for some engagement with theory once they managed to escape the clutches of school and arrive at university. They were already engaged properly in a literary theoretical discussion as Year 8 students. And if we are attentive, it seems to me that that's what goes on a regular basis in classrooms in schools. It's exactly, my student sense was exactly my sense of what was happening when I started off as a proper teacher in Stepney Green School in the 1980s. And it's also something that has been picked up more recently in an essay written by one of my PGC students last year, Lucy Thompson-Sharp, who, it's an essay that I've published in Changing English, who writes about teaching King Lear to a Year 7 group in a boys' school in South London. And what she did in a lesson that I was privileged to observe as a kind of grand finale to their exploration of King Lear was to present them with Shakespeare's Lear on the one hand and Nahum Tate's version of Lear, in which they all live happily ever after. Well, the good characters do, bad characters not so much. And she got them talking about which version they preferred. and she got them talking about the differences between the two. And again, what's going on there seems to me the thing itself, literary study, not a preparation for it. So they are operating within the discipline, but operating on their terms. And here's another thing about English, if it is a discipline, and I think there are questions to be raised there, that if one attempts to trace the history of English or literary study, the dynamism that's to be found in it is not explicable as a set of internal processes. Insofar as it has changed, it's changed in response at least as much to changes in the world beyond the academy, the women's movement, the activism of Black and minority ethnic community organizations, revolutions in technologies of representation and communication, to name just a few of the things that have impelled English as a discipline to be a different thing now than it was when I was an undergraduate, say. And it's worth making the point that these changes have often, though not always, seen developments in school English at the same time as, or in advance of, changes in university English. So the story of English is one that challenges the picture of school subjects as kind of bastard children of university disciplines. I'm not at all sure that that will work. Anyway, to return to Michael's lesson for a moment from my 2017 paper, Derry comments, in my example of the English lessons, students freely draw upon any resources that are meaningful to them, but in order to function persuasively, their crafting of their work must be responsive to reasons that are recognized and shared. Sharing here, says Derry, does not entail shared culture or biography, but agreement upon what norms are in play. In order to communicate, it's necessary for the students to draw on recognized standards of correctness or rules of application. Regardless of whether or not they comply with or invert or subvert those standards, the crucial point is that they cannot ignore the rules. But I think the mistake that Derry is making here is to imagine that normativity, recognized standards of correctness, if you will, though I think there are problems with glossing it like that, relates only to the rules of the discipline. Insofar as there are norms at play here, and of course there are, these norms are as much about and derived from the students' shared sense of a West African cultural and linguistic set of practices, since these constitute the material on which they're working. So, for example, it would be perfectly legitimate for somebody in the group who are presenting, or another member of Michael's class, to object that the group's representation was inaccurate. Such an objection would entail an appeal to relevant norms, but they wouldn't be the norms that Derry has in mind. They'd be different norms. Likewise, the norms that are in play in Harriet's Romeo and Juliet lesson are not only derived from the discipline of English, but also from the students' own deeply normative ethical judgments. What they have to say about Capulet's behavior is responsive to reasons that are recognized and shared, but not to do with literary norms particularly, I don't think. And on that, how am I doing? I'm running out of time, aren't I? One of the things that's happening in my observation of school English is that I think there's a significant risk that Romeo and Juliet will become unstudyable in the near future. And that isn't because the language has become more arcane than it used to be. It's because what I'm encountering in lessons that I observe with increasing frequency is that school students find it so morally repugnant that a girl who is not 14 years old should be engaged in a sexual relationship, that they consider that the whole representation that is entailed in Romeo and Juliet is beyond the pale. And in that sense, what they're doing is deploying a set of normative judgments that are absolutely deeply ethical judgments, but that create huge problems for the study of that particular Shakespearean text in a contemporary context. So, if that's happening in relation to Romeo and Juliet, it is happening differently, particularly in London classrooms, in relation to the reading of Mice and Men or Lord of the Flies, for instance, because of the use in such texts of the N-word. And other of my students have recently been writing, I think, really interestingly about the dilemmas that are posed for them and for other teachers about the presence of the N-word in literary texts. Again, these things are real and are part of a structure of normativity that is invoked in the teaching of English, but that are not reducible, I think, to the kind of disciplinary normativity that Jan Derry was invoking. So to return kind of finally to the question of linguistic knowledge and normativity, I'd suggest that what we need is not some sort of Saussurean notion of correctness, an appeal to a sort of abstract or Platonic kind of correctness, but rather to Voloshinov's theory of the sign. So a last quote, not from Jan, but from Voloshinov. Every sign, as we know, is a construct between socially organized persons in the process of their interaction. Therefore, the forms of signs are conditioned above all by the social organization of the participants involved, and also by the immediate conditions of their interaction. When these forms change, so does the sign. And I think that's the way that the social enters into and is crucial to the question of disciplinarity at the level of the theory of the sign. And the space of reasons, it seems to me, is there in the way that signs are made and remade by socially organized persons in the process of their interaction. And one of the most interesting places to observe such interactions is an English classroom, particularly when the teacher is as attentive as Michael and Harriet were to the meanings that their students were making. And I should stop there.
Thank you, John. Thanks, and I'm resisting the desperate desire to respond.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I realise it places you in an impossible position.
People who know me know it's hard to shut me up.
Go for it, Dylan. Go for it.
So I better not say anything. I better quickly hand over to Catherine.
Jan, I can imagine that you probably have lots to say in response to John. So I think it would be a missed opportunity if you didn't get a chance to do that after I say a few words. So I should thank you as well for having me, and just to say that I have responded to John's 2017 paper, which he circulated before this evening's event. So not quite responding to the paper that John was just talking about in Dan's inaugural lecture. John, there's a couple of slides, but if you would hold off for a second, I'll let you know when I'd like you to show one of the slides, please, if that's okay.
Okay.
If you could share your screen in a little bit, I'll give you a nod when. Okay, so I'm responding to Yandell's 2017 paper, and I'd like to say that there's so much to admire in this work, but I want to raise two concerns. Firstly, I got the impression that John seems squeamish about the idea of better knowledge, but curiously, he does not behave in the text as if there's no such thing as better knowledge. And the second point is that I thought that John, quite understandably, fell into the trap of using the very conceptualization of knowledge as object that he was trying to challenge. So I'd like to speak about those 2 points for a little bit. So the first one, to take the first point, John's squeamishness about better knowledge. I think we would do well to worry about how an acknowledgement of better knowledge can lead to an unhelpful privileging of the teacher's knowledge. The idea of better knowledge can become a hop, skip and jump on towards a transmission model of teaching, and ultimately a hazardous neglect of the social dimension essential in knowledge formation. And John talks about this worry early in his paper. And I agree, if we lose the social or strip agency from the knower in the learning process, or prioritize some content or knowledge over other content based on no more than what Michael Young refers to as the knowledge of the powerful, then we're done for. But my interest is in suggesting how we can reject the unhelpful reification of knowledge without letting go of the notion of better knowledge and a knowable world. And then to move to the second point, I can also see why John would fall back on conceptualizations that he's trying to reject, because as yet, we haven't made enough ground dispelling how existing couplets, such as curriculum and pedagogy, facts and reasoning, substantive and disciplinary knowledge, comprehending object and object comprehended, can distort our understanding of teaching, learning and knowledge. And again, my interest is in explaining how these couplets can help us and so can be used if carefully qualified. but I want to reject what I see as their current misapprehension. So just to elaborate on the 2 points, as I see them arising in John's ideas. John appears squeamish about better knowledge, but as I said, does not behave as if we can do away with the notion of better knowledge. Rather, his text relies on it. So for example, John relies on judgments about better when he discerns improvements in Michael's teaching from the first to the second placement, or when he's disappointed at the closing down of knowledge towards the end of Harriet's lesson. And I'd want to argue that John, knowing that we don't know tutor reactions, but have reason to believe these were diverse, does indeed trump pupil or teacher assertions of singular, monolithic, or overly deterministic tutor reactions. Yet John seems uneasy with this idea that his understanding of reactions to Shakespeare is better than Harriet's or her mentors or the pupils, while simultaneously knowing that challenging misplaced certitude is better. That is more knowledgeable than not challenging such certitude. To ignore or underplay or deny what teachers already know in good measure that they would like for their pupils to know, I think is as problematic as conceptualizing knowledge as the possession of the teacher. It is as if John worries that to grant such a thing as better knowledge amounts to a denial of knowledge as social, and I'd want to argue how it need not. I agree with John that what we can't have is better knowledge that's based on some fixed foundation. We don't get to check at the door our responsibility for determining and redetermining better and for understanding and critiquing judgments of better. But neither do we get to just see what happens to emerge in educative interaction without a sense of what better might look like and entail. The lesson ought to be going somewhere, as indeed is the case in John's commendation of what's worthwhile about both Michael and Harriet's lessons. And I want to say that meeting pupils where they are in no sense implies leaving them where they are, but nor does wanting to move pupils' understanding on imply that knowledge somehow stops being a social undertaking. And as to my second point, I worry John, despite acknowledging the problem of knowledge appearing as both entity and act, for example, when he draws attention to his own use of the term possession of knowledge, nevertheless inadvertently seems to behave as if knowledge can be construed as objectified. And I'd like to quote Jan, if you wouldn't mind putting up the slides. I've got 2 quotes from John. And if you could let me know when those slides are visible. I can see that first slide now.
Okay, so there should be now. I was going to leave the ones down the side. I hope people can see them okay like this.
That's great. And what I wanted to do is just let John speak for himself as what he wrote in the article. So it's worth looking at how John grapples with existing conceptualization of knowledge. And here he's speaking of Michael, and he writes, John, would you mind reading your quotation?
Okay. His problem wasn't with travel writing or with Shakespeare, or, to return to my starting point, with unsystematic or nugatory knowledge of grammar. It was with Shakespeare or grammar or travel writing as a focus of activity in the classroom. It was, I'm suggesting, not knowledge in the abstract, but knowledge in the context of the pedagogic relations of schooling that was proving tricky for him. And the trickiness lay primarily in the pedagogic relations, not in the knowledge, insofar as the two are in any sense separable. In the opening sentence of this paragraph, I wrote about Michael possessing or not possessing subject knowledge, but I'm not at all sure that this is an appropriate verb or a helpful way of thinking about knowledge. To treat knowledge as an entity that can become the possession of an individual is to reify it, to remove it from the social semiotic processes that are implicated in the production of knowledge.
Thank you. So I think John tries to explain the change in Michael's knowledge by coming off what knowledge is and turning to the context of where knowledge is happening and to who is knowing and with what purpose. But I do not think this explains Michael's transition from first to second placement, from not knowing to knowing. And in seeking this resolution, John gives ground that I wouldn't want to give. Michael may have fared no better in any other context, say as undergraduate seminars or papers, where John's knowledge in the abstract might be believed to pertain, because there's no such thing in any context. There is the representation of knowledge disembodied from knowers, but there is no abstract knowledge in the sense of devoid of agency. What Michael didn't have was knowledge with the depth or reach to allow him to recognize the pupil's knowledge as knowledge of the very thing he was trying to teach. Michael himself may not have had such depth of knowledge without the pupil's help, and he may have suffered from exactly the same limitation in his undergraduate discussion. And down we go, afflicted by the same criticism John levels at Schulman's pedagogical content knowledge, when he says Schulman treats such knowledge as existing outside the social. We can say that Michael has come to understand pedagogical relations rather than subject knowledge of English as a figure of speech. But insofar as we have now been complicit in creating a phantom knowledge type distinct from some other knowledge type, we are further distorting the picture of what is really going on and of what knowledge is, always and only an embodied process or activity. And John knows this. We see his grasp of the absurdity of misunderstanding different knowledge types in his discussion of everyday versus systematic knowledge. I agree wholeheartedly that what John knows about Arthur Brooks does not amount to a different kind of knowledge from that of Harriet and her pupils. We see John's grasp of the potential absurdity of different knowledge classifications to explain different understandings again when, having discussed pupils' travel advert promoting Nigeria as a holiday destination, John writes, and Jan, would you bring up the second slide? John, would you mind reading your second slide?
What then was the knowledge base of this lesson? Was it travel writing or the language of advertising or persuasive techniques? It was, but not in the sense that these areas of knowledge might be taken as fixed categories. For as Dakey and McClenahan argue, genre is a product of the social relationships in which it's employed. It both mediates and is mediated by those relationships, with the result that it can never be reduced to a set of rules that people automatically follow in their exchanges with one another. In Michael's classroom, knowledge of the advertisement as a generic category was being produced through a series of generative activities, each of which was located in and made meaningful through the cultures and histories of the participants, cultures and histories that were simultaneously the material that was being worked on and the object of attention.
Thank you. So John is quite right to surface the tension that plagues our thinking. We need a better way of handling the entity and act-like appearance of knowledge. How are we to cope with the fact that the categories we use, because they help us, also mislead us and distort the nature of knowledge? The thing that we say has been made is not a thing at all, and it's not a thing that can be given. It exists in the making alone. How, as teacher educators, do we get this nature of knowledge across without sounding like a riddlemeister, rejecting all that feels helpful, solid, actionable? So just to move to my own sort of thinking on this, I can't discuss my own work here, but let me say that I find it helpful to distinguish a story of knowledge appropriate to a fine-grained level of description, that is a story about the nature of knowledge, from a story of how knowledge can appear to us once we have it. And I'd like to offer two diagrams to begin that conversation. So the first slide, Jan, of the diagram of the triangle, which I hope you can see, of defined knowledge at a fine-grained level of description as our responsivity in and to the world on the bottom left-hand corner of the triangle, onto which we layer conceptions of correctness or appropriateness of response. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got responsivity to the world, to correlations, commonalities, incompatibilities, and in the case of conceptual knowledge, inferential understandings in the world. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got the representation of knowledge, representations of or expressions of something. But these are meaningless squeaks and squiggles, incapable of reference without responsivity. And then at the top, at the apex of the triangle, we've got the world, including the social world. And my point is that representation of knowledge, what is written and said, feels like it conveys or carries meaning, and it does, but only insofar as it expresses or represents what learners are already responsive to in the world. And so in my second diagram, I try to show how our experience of language can cloud our grasp of the workings of language, And Jan, if we just go to the second slide, I'll just go through it using the numbers to help me. So first, we've got in the middle of the diagram language. And from language, we have number 2 there. It calls up, or it seems to call up the world, making the world available to us. And 3A, it feels like 3B, and it does, but only under certain conditions. And then I'd move to 4 on the left-hand side, only insofar as our responsivity to the world, including the world of language, is there to be named and expressed and represented. Otherwise, the squeaks and squiggles of language do not express anything at all for that person. So to take a classroom example, just to illustrate that, a student teacher was teaching about the Wannsee Conference, in which Adolf Eichmann uses the term final solution to describe the task of killing European Jews. The student teacher wanted Year 9 to understand the power of language, in this case, Eichmann's deliberate use of euphemism when discussing genocide, as revealed in the reading the student teacher provided, which gave Eichmann's account of the conference. Now, as the student teacher and I talked about this lesson, in the early stages of the lesson planning, the student teacher simply wanted to ask pupils directly about why Eichmann had made the choices he had in what he chose to say. But this is to presume that pupils could access or understand both the reading provided and the question posed. And on reflection, as we talked it through, the student teacher saw how pupils could benefit from thinking about familiar instances of euphemism, something age appropriate along the lines of why we use other words like passing when speaking of death. So reworking the lesson plan, the student teacher decided that pupils would be invited to read an extract from the Wannsee Conference and speculate about what Eichmann was suggesting or talking about. And having pupils identify that Eichmann's point was the genocide of the Jews, pupils would then be asked to pick out where in the text Eichmann said so. And from this, a discussion of familiar instances of euphemism could be used to lever pupils back into the text to tease out Eichmann's phrasing and its effects. The key term euphemism could then be introduced. And my point in this simple example is that learners were already responsive to the relations between phenomena in the world that are conveyed by the word euphemism. And it is this responsiveness that allows euphemism to bear reference. We do not need the word euphemism to be responsive to phenomena in the world to which that word refers. But when we have that word, it frees us to reflect on our knowledge and use it differently. And this, I believe, is what John refers to as Vygotski's systematic versus everyday knowledge at the end, towards the end of his paper. And there's lots more to be said about how this works and what it means for teaching and learning. And paramount would be what this means for teachers as they work to create the conditions of responsiveness, which are intended to form the basis of meaning making and concept development. So to conclude, we need to do the work of rejecting naive conceptualizations of what knowledge is without losing A, the power of language to represent, B, the world to be known, or C, the ways in which we need to say that some responsivity is better than other responsivity. We don't want to find ourselves in the position of not being able to handle the potential power of the representation of knowledge and its cumulative development, or not being able to talk about or need to judge better. But we'll not get closer to realizing the potential of language and the potential of systematic knowledge if we don't tell a better story about the nature of knowledge than the story that we currently tell. Like to leave it there, Jan?
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks. You did a better job than I could. Although I just want to thank John as well, because he's made me realise how inadequate my writing and my communication is from the interpretation you made of my argument. Okay, so let's just give you a couple of minutes to think about questions, and people can start writing questions in the chat, and then in a couple of minutes' time, I won't give you very long. We'll start. I'll come to you and ask you to say your question.